Hey guys, Mike here from Lunch Money Comics. It is a gorgeous fall day, and I'm in the beautiful state of New Hampshire hoping to go for a hike. But while I'm up here, I figured I should stop at one of my most favorite comic stores in the whole wide world, Enterprise Comics in Keene, New Hampshire. They have a little bit of everything for the geek and every one of us. They have, of course, comic books. They also have board games, magic cards, Dungeons and Dragons, you name it, they have it. But not only that, they actually have a comic book on hold for me. So let's go inside, guys, and check out this amazing store. So like I said, I was primarily here to pick up a single book, but I figured I'd get a little bit of footage of the store as well. To be clear, the owners did not ask me to do this. It's just a really photogenic store, and I like making YouTube videos, so indulge me. Now, this is mostly a comic book store, and of course, they have an entire wall dedicated to new releases, but they have far more back issues, and this store is incredibly well organized, with comics sorted by publisher, which is identified by the box, then alphabetically by title, and then volume or series. But this store has so many other cool things. They have an amazing D&D selection full of props and items to enhance your gaming sessions, and all the polyhedral dice you could possibly need. And of course, some incredible miniatures, some of which stretch the definition of miniature. This Tiamat statue is massive. They also have a ton of games, including a very well organized Magic the Gathering section. My son spent the entire time picking up Magic singles, and their board games are pretty sweet too. They actually have a back room just for gaming, and we chatted with some Magic players hanging out in the back there. They also have some really nice statues. I actually saw them sell a few while I was there, and although I don't really collect them, I do love looking at them, and there were a couple of really funny ones like this Stan Lee from Thor Ragnarok. Now, even though I was there to grab one comic, I couldn't help but look through the back issues. You see, again, they're well organized, and these indie boxes have some pretty cool rare titles within, as well as some of the more well-known ones. Here I am taking a peek at Invincible, which I've been getting into a lot more lately. Let me know down in the comments if you're a fan. Now you can see here that all of their wall books are missing, and that's because one of the owners, Tim, was actually at a comic book show that day, which was a little bit further than I was willing to drive to. So he brought most of the good stuff with him. However, there was still plenty of good stuff to dig through. Here you see their discount slab books. Nothing insanely good in here, but you can definitely find some really good deals. But they also have boxes of raw comics that are more valuable or key issues, and I found some fantastic stuff in here in the past. So here I am looking through the Astonishing Tales run, trying to find a specific issue, and here I find it, Astonishing Tales number 12. And why did I want this book? Because it ties directly to the book I was there to pick up.
There it is, the book I was waiting for. Savage Tales number 1, first appearance of Man-Thing. And a gnarly cool cover at that. Awesome. Thanks for holding it for me.
Of course.
So I ended up with 2 awesome key issues for myself and a stack of Magic cards picked out by my son. All right, guys, I absolutely love that store. I got a couple of really cool things. Let's go back to the house and talk about them. So there you go. That was Enterprise Comics, etc. in Keene, New Hampshire. And that etc. is really important because as you saw in the footage, they have a lot more than comic books. As a matter of fact, every nerdy hobby that I'm into, they have represented there. Not only that, it is an absolutely gorgeous store. One of the prettiest in all of New England. Incredibly clean and unbelievably organized. I don't know how they keep it as organized as they do. Forget the comic books. Even the Magic cards are organized alphabetically. Absolutely awesome place. And myself and my son love going there whenever we can. But on this day, we had an ulterior motive, and that is, of course, I had a comic book put aside for me. A pretty awesome one, which I'm excited to talk about. Before I do, head on down, consider hitting that like button. Follow me on Instagram under Lunch Money Comics IG. Let me tell you a little bit of a backstory of how this comic book ended up getting put aside for me. So a few weeks ago, I was at a comic book show also in New Hampshire. Enterprise was set up there, and I spoke to the owner, Tim. I've known Tim for years. I was looking at his amazing wall books, and I saw this book that I've wanted. A book that features the first appearance of an awesome Marvel character, a Marvel monster. I'm really into those monster type characters. And I looked at this book and it was great. Not only that, he was having a sale of 20% off all of those books. An incredible deal, but for whatever reason, I ended up not getting it at the show. I was in a super rush. But when I was editing the video of that show later on, I was looking at the footage and saying, man, why didn't I get this? So I called Tim up and I said, hey, Tim, do you still have that book? He said, yeah. I said, is it still on sale? He said, yeah. I said, I'm going to be in the area tomorrow. Can I pick it up? And he said, well, I'm not going to be there. I'm going to that other show. but he left it aside with his wife, Tracy, the other owner, for me to pick up. So I had to go up there. We were hiking in the area. Totally worth stopping in to get this amazing book. No point in dragging it out any further. You know exactly what it is. It is this. This is Savage Tales #1 from 1971, and you see it is a magazine-sized publication by Marvel Comics featuring lots of stories in black and white art. And some fantastic artists worked in this book. We have Barry Windsor-Smith, John Romita, Gene Colan, and this amazing cover by John Buscema. And it's a pretty violent cover. It's Conan the Barbarian holding up a head. The reason they could get away with this, you see right here, this publication is rated M for the mature reader. Yeah, this was not subject to the Comics Code Authority, and because of that, they could put some more violent or terrifying stories within. But the reason I wanted it, of course, is because it's the first appearance of Marvel's Man-Thing. Now, I think most people know who Man-Thing is, but it's worth reminding some of you with this book. So this is Man-Thing #1. It came out years later, but this is the first issue of the first ongoing series featuring him. And you see right here, he is a swamp creature. Now, there are lots of swamp creatures in comic books, and a lot of them, as a matter of fact, came about in 1971. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but yeah, he's a big old swamp monster. Not only that, he's got a couple of other really cool supernatural abilities, which I'll also talk about. So I think most people know who Man-Thing is now, and he actually recently appeared in the MCU in Werewolf by Night. But his creation actually is a pretty interesting story that I want to get into, because he was originally created, or at least conceived by, actually Stan Lee. Stan Lee, seeing this long legacy of swamp creatures going back into the Golden Age with like the Heap, decided, hey, I have an idea for a new character. He sat down with Roy Thomas in late 1970 to flesh out this story. And they sort of played around with some ideas of who this character would be, what their powers would be, things like that, their origin story. And then Roy Thomas took that general plot and gave it to Jerry Conway. So Jerry Conway scripted the comic book. Then they got together with Gray Morrow, an artist, and they made the first Man-Thing story, which appears in here. And I gotta point out, guys, that Gray Morrow is an incredible artist. The pencil work was fantastic, and I'm really happy this is in black and white art, because if they had colored it, I don't think it would be as evocative. Yeah, and we're introduced to this character named Ted Sallis. Now, Ted Sallis is a scientist who's working down in the Everglades in Florida on a super soldier serum. I think everyone knows what the super soldier serum is, but in general, in Marvel Comics, unless your name is Steve Rogers, messing around with the super soldier serum usually ends really badly for you. Happens to a whole bunch of characters. Well, the same thing happens to poor Ted Sallis, because he's not the only one after this serum. He's also being chased down by AIM. AIM, Advanced Idea Mechanics. They are basically some scientist terrorists out to conquer the world. They're also looking for the serum. They go after him. He runs into the swamp, and to protect the serum, he injects himself with it and then promptly falls into a magical swamp. And he emerges as Man-Thing, a swamp creature. Now, unlike other swamp creatures, he actually loses his humanity. There's not much of Ted Sallis left over at the end of this, although sometimes over the later decades, his personality would seep in. For the most part, he's just a big old scary strong monster. On top of that, though, he got some really cool abilities. His primary one is that anyone who feels fear is burned by his touch. Yeah, so if you're scared, like primarily of him, and he touches you, he'll burn you. Initially, it was more like acid, and then later on, it's more like fire. Either way, that's a pretty cool power. And the other thing is this, he's actually the protector of the nexus of all realities. I mentioned that swamp he fell into was magical. That's because evidently the Everglades in Florida house a portal to the multiverse, and the swamp sort of willed him to become its protector. So because of that, he has all sorts of multiverse shenanigans. So, very cool character. And again, we're introduced to all of that backstory in this issue right here. Now, I mentioned a few other things about swamp creatures, because 1971 was a really interesting year. Right after Man-Thing came out in this issue, like a month later, we are introduced to a character that's often compared to him, but is clearly a little bit more famous, which is DC's Swamp Thing. Now, Swamp Thing has an almost identical origin story. The character gets doused with a whole bunch of chemicals, falls into a swamp, and comes out as a swamp creature. But outside their origin story, they diverge quite wildly. Whereas Man-Thing is more of a sort of a hulking brute and doesn't have much of his personality, Swamp Thing, that's not the case. He talks, and he's intelligent, and he also is more supernatural, I think, than Man-Thing is. But either way, guys, they're very similar characters that compare to a lot. but there's some really interesting publication history between them, because I mentioned Jerry Conway, one of the writers and creators of Man-Thing. Well, his roommate at the time was Len Wein. And Len Wein is the creator of Swamp Thing. Yeah, they were roommates at the time, and those two characters came out a month apart. Yeah, there was some talk about some legal action between Marvel and DC, but again, outside of the origin story, they're wildly different characters, and I guess when Len Wein was approached about it, he's like, I don't see the similarities. I think that's pretty funny. So a month after this comes out, we get House of Secrets 92, which is the first appearance of Swamp Thing. Now, both those characters would get their own ongoing title later on, but 1971 was still a really interesting year because, believe it or not, they weren't the only two swamp creatures that came out that year. No, about a month after House of Secrets 92, we get this. We get DC's Phantom Stranger number 14. And look who's on the front. This is a different swamp creature. Yeah, DC had two swamp creatures going on in 1971, months apart. This one's called Spectre of the Stalking Swamp, or the Swamp Stalker. This is an amazing cover by Neil Adams, though I think the art on the inside is Jim Aparo. But who wrote this book? Once again, Len Wein. Len Wein had two different characters, swamp creatures, for DC in 1971. And one thing I want to point out, guys, if you look at this art by Neil Adams, and if you just imagine a little like long nose hanging on him, it looks exactly like Man-Thing. Very, very similar. Now, I mentioned a whole bunch of people, right? I mentioned Roy Thomas, Jerry Conway, Len Wein, Neil Adams. All of these names are going to come up multiple times as I get into the story, because clearly there was a lot of cross-pollination, at least in terms of the creative juices for swamp creatures back then, right? So we have a third swamp creature in 1971. But let's go back to this book right here, because as I said, Marvel wanted this to be a new character, a character that had, an ongoing stories attached to him. The problem is this. Savage Tales number 1 sold terribly. It did really, really bad, and they canceled it after only one issue. Now, there would be a Savage Tales number 2. It wouldn't come out till years later. However, there was a problem. They thought this would be a great character, and they started working on the second story of Man-Thing. And who did they get to do the art on that story? Neil Adams. And who wrote that story? Len Wein. Yeah, Len Wein, who had just created Swamp Thing, the stalking swamp monster, and was roommates of Jerry Conway, wrote the second story featuring Man-Thing. So, the story gets canceled, right? They don't have any place to put it. Well, Roy Thomas, who I mentioned a little while ago, had an idea. Roy Thomas was working at the time on Astonishing Tales, and he said, I know, let's sneak that Man-Thing story, those 7 pages that Neil Adams did in Len Wein, we'll just put it into the Kazar story. And that's why we have this book here. And that's why I picked it up. This is Astonishing Tales number 12 from 1972. You see, it's featuring Lord of the Hidden Jungle, Kazar. Now, this is really, really interesting because the story starts off with Kazar down in Florida doing Kazar things. There's a mystery in the Everglades. There's some people that got hurt, and he says, I know, it must be the legend of the Man-Thing. Now, that story is written by Roy Thomas, and the art is by John Buscema, another name that keeps coming up. But at that point in the story, they say, hey, we have these 7 pages, let's just slide them right in. So I got to show this to you guys. It's unbelievable because it's kind of a non sequitur. The story changes, the art changes, and it's pretty funny. So here we have the Buscema art, and we have the Roy Thomas story, and then they say, hey, it must be the Man-Thing. And all of a sudden, the story and the art changes. In fact, you can see it side by side, right? Buscema art, Neil Adams art. And there's literally 7 pages of what presumably was supposed to be black and white art. You see they've colored it a little bit. But yeah, it's literally shoehorned in just to make a story. And then after those 7 pages, it goes back to the Buscema art. So I just think that's awesome, guys. It's just really funny to see sort of how these creative decisions were made back then. They were making this character work no matter what. And I just thought this was awesome and a really cool, just a little curiosity in comic book publishing. So I thought it was awesome. And because of that, while I was there getting first Man-Thing, I had to get this book as well. Yes, this is the second appearance of Man-Thing, but it's also the first appearance of him in color. And it's also his first appearance in a standard American-sized comic book. So I had to absolutely get this while I was there. There's a few more claims to fame in these books. So in Savage Tales number 1, in that Man-Thing story, we're also introduced to a character named Ellen Brandt, who appears to be the love interest of Ted Sallis. I think later they say it's actually his wife, but she's actually secretly working for AIM. She is like a sleeper agent out to get, this super soldier serum. And once, Salas turns into Man-Thing, he actually touches her and burns her. She's afraid of him. He burns her face and ends up scarring her. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is Ellen Brandt actually appeared in the MCU. Yeah, she actually appeared way back in Iron Man 3. And there's some similarities. One, she is scarred. And two, she does work for AIM. But that's pretty much where it ends. In that movie, she's an extremist-powered terrorist. And she has a very notable fight scene with Tony Stark. But there's no mention of Man-Thing whatsoever. But because she's associated with AIM, they used her. And again, they used her scar. Which again, in the movie, it seems to be like a war injury. Thought it was pretty cool. First, Ellen Brandt. Fun little footnote. And in this one right here, Astonishing Tales 12, we're introduced to the character of Barbara Morse in her first full appearance. Barbara Morse would later be known as the character of Mockingbird, a longtime member of the West Coast Avengers, often associated with Hawkeye. Her first cameo appearance was in Astonishing Tales number 6, and then this would be her first full appearance. So, a couple of minor characters, but still, first appearances in there. Now, let's talk about the condition of these books. So, this book here is a very sturdy book. I was able to open it up and read it, and it's fantastic. However, it is sort of a lower grade book. Not only does it have some, color breaks here, and it's certainly down in the bottom corner, the biggest blemish is right there. There's actually a chip missing out of that bottom corner. It's a square bound book. These would often take some damage. That's okay. We're calling this, I think, a 3.0. Maybe it's slightly better than that. Again, that chip is a bummer, but it's still a very nice, solid book. And I actually think Tim had this price accurately the first time. He had it at $225, but he was offering 20% off, which would have brought this down to about $175. But here's the thing. When I told him I was going out of my way to pick this book up, because I'm a friend of his and a friend of the store, he rounded down. He sold this to me for $150, which I think is a crazy good deal for this book. I'm excited. And that is why when I found this book for $25, I didn't even argue with Tracy whatsoever. I was willing to pay the sticker price, absolutely. So I got both of these for $175, which I think is a fantastic deal. So I'm pretty excited to add both of these to my collection, especially this one. I've wanted it for a while, and I already have a pretty good spot picked out for it on the shelf behind me. But head on down to the comments and let me know what you think. What do you think of these books? What do you think of the price that I paid? And also, what do you think about these swamp creatures? What is your favorite swamp creature? And I mean all the swamp creatures. Do you like the stalking swamp? Do you like the heap? And of course, oftentimes they make you pick between Man-Thing and Swamp Thing. Honestly, you don't need to. You can be like me and love both of them equally. I love both these characters. What I think is more interesting is the publication history between them, because we tend to think of Marvel and DC as being separate publishers, but there were so many people that worked for both. Clearly, there was a lot of overlap in the creative juices in 1971, and I think we're all better off for it. Head on down in the comments, guys, and let me know what you think of all of this. And in the meantime, keep hunting for comic books in strange and unusual places. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.